On large farms across the American Midwest, there's a warning many farmers quietly pass to each other. Never open the silo after midnight. Not because of superstition, not because of ghosts, but because sometimes things inside a silo shouldn't be disturbed. Jacob Miller bought the farm in late autumn. The property sat nearly 40 minutes from the nearest town. A long dirt road led to the house. 2 old cattle barns stood beside a rusted grain shed, and behind everything, a tall concrete silo rose out of the field. The silo had clearly been there for decades. Its gray walls were stained with age. Thin cracks ran down the concrete like veins, and at the base of the tower sat a heavy steel door. The previous owner sold the farm for far less than the land was worth. Jacob asked why. The man only said one thing: "Don't use the silo." Jacob assumed it was just an old farmer's superstition. He had worked farms for most of his life. He knew people in rural towns believed strange things. But the land was good, the fields were wide, and the price was impossible to ignore. So Jacob bought the farm. 3 days after moving in, he decided to inspect the silo. The steel door opened with a long, metallic groan. The inside was completely dark. Jacob aimed his flashlight downward. The silo was almost half full of corn. Dry yellow grain filled the bottom like a quiet ocean. There was nothing unusual, no footprints, no animal tracks, no birds. Jacob closed the door and walked back toward the house. He assumed the previous owner simply didn't want to deal with clearing out the grain. That night, Jacob woke up to a strange sound. It was difficult to describe. Something like dry sand shifting, or someone walking slowly across a soft surface. Jacob lay still in bed for several seconds, listening. The sound came from behind the house, from the field, from the direction of the silo. Jacob glanced at the clock beside his bed. 2:31 a.m. The sound came again. One step, then another. Slow, heavy, like someone walking across the surface of the grain. Jacob sat up and pulled the curtain aside. The silo stood silent in the darkness. No light, no movement. But the sound continued. One step, then another. And suddenly, Jacob realized something that made the back of his neck tighten. The sound wasn't coming from the bottom of the silo. It was coming from the surface of the corn, as if someone was walking on top of it. Jacob didn't go outside to check the silo that night. Anyone who has lived on a farm long enough learns one simple rule. Night is not the right time to investigate strange sounds, especially when your nearest neighbor lives miles away. Jacob stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself the sound had a normal explanation. Maybe the wind was pushing against the metal vents. Maybe the grain inside the silo was shifting as the temperature dropped. Farms were full of strange noises. Most of them had simple reasons. But 10 minutes later, the sound came again. One slow step, then another. The same heavy movement across dry grain. Jacob pulled the blanket higher over his chest. He told himself it was nothing. Eventually, sometime before morning, he fell asleep. When the sun rose, Jacob walked straight to the silo. Daylight changed everything. The farm looked quiet, normal, almost peaceful. No footprints around the silo, no disturbed dirt, no sign that anyone had been there during the night. Jacob opened the steel door again. The hinges groaned as the heavy metal swung outward. He pointed his flashlight down into the silo. The corn lay still at the bottom, a wide yellow surface stretching across the tower. But after a few seconds, Jacob noticed something strange. The surface of the grain wasn't flat anymore. In the center of the silo, there was a shallow depression, not deep, maybe 8 inches, but clearly visible, as if something had stood there. Jacob frowned. Walking across loose grain would leave marks. That was normal. But there was a problem. There was no way for anything to enter the silo from above. The top hatch had rusted shut years ago, and inside the silo, there was no ladder. Jacob studied the grain carefully. There were no footprints, no animal tracks, nothing. Just the shallow indentation. He stared for a long moment, then shrugged. Maybe the grain had settled during the night. Maybe it had shifted under its own weight. Jacob closed the door and walked back toward the house. The farm still felt ordinary in the daylight. That night, Jacob stayed awake on purpose. He turned off every light inside the house, sat in a chair near the kitchen window, and watched the field behind the barn. The silo stood motionless in the darkness, a tall shadow against the sky. For a long time, nothing happened. 1 o'clock, 1:40, 2:10. Jacob started to think the previous night had been nothing more than his imagination. Then, at exactly 2:27 a.m., the sound returned. A faint rustling, like thousands of dry kernels sliding against each other. Jacob stood up immediately. He turned off the small radio beside him. The room fell silent, but the sound outside continued. 1 step, then another. Slow, deliberate. Jacob stared through the window toward the silo. The tower looked completely still, no shadows moving, no light. But inside, something was clearly walking across the surface of the grain. And the strangest part was, whoever was moving in there was not in any hurry. It sounded like something that knew. No one could see it. Jacob was not the kind of man who believed in strange stories. He had worked farms for nearly 15 years, and farms made all kinds of noises. Wind inside metal pipes, rats inside the grain shed, corn shifting when the air temperature changed. But there was one thing Jacob couldn't ignore anymore. The surface of the grain had changed twice, and each time it happened after he heard footsteps during the night. On the 3rd morning, Jacob decided to test something. He brought a long measuring tape and a piece of rope. When he opened the silo door, the smell of dry grain drifted upward. Dust floated through the beam of his flashlight. He tied a small stone to the end of the rope, then slowly lowered it into the silo. The rope slid down into the darkness. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. Then, the stone touched the surface of the corn. Jacob marked the rope with a piece of tape. That would tell him the exact height of the grain. If anything moved during the night, the measurement would change. Jacob pulled the rope back up, closed the heavy door, and went back to the house. It was the simplest way to know if something inside the silo was moving. That night, Jacob didn't sleep. He sat in the living room with the lights off, only a small lamp beside his chair. Outside the window, the field was completely dark. The silo stood like a tall shadow against the sky. Time moved slowly. 1 in the morning, 1:50, 2:18. Jacob felt his eyes getting heavy. Then the sound returned, a dry, shifting noise, like someone stirring a huge pile of sand. Jacob stood up immediately and turned off the lamp. The room fell silent, but the sound outside continued. 1 step, then another. Slow, heavy. Something was moving again, inside the silo. Jacob stared through the window, but nothing moved outside. The tower remained perfectly still, yet the sound continued, as if someone was walking in slow circles across the grain. The next morning, Jacob ran straight to the silo. He opened the door and shined his flashlight down. The grain was lower, not much, only a few inches, but enough to notice. Jacob compared the rope to the mark he made yesterday. The stone now dropped deeper than before, which meant something inside the silo had pressed the grain down during the night. Jacob frowned. There was only one explanation. Maybe an animal had fallen inside, a large one, a dog, maybe a deer. But the top hatch of the silo had rusted shut years ago. There was no opening big enough for an animal to enter. Jacob stood there for a moment, thinking. Then he decided to try something else. He walked back to the house and grabbed an old dash camera from his truck. Jacob tied the camera to the end of the rope, turned on the recording, then slowly lowered it into the silo. The camera spun gently as it descended. The concrete walls slid past in the dim light. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Finally, the camera reached the surface of the grain. Jacob left it there for a few minutes, then pulled it back up. He returned to the house and plugged the camera into his computer. The video began to play. At first, there was only darkness. Then, the inside of the silo appeared. Gray concrete walls, old cracks, dust drifting through the air. Then the camera reached the surface of the corn, thousands of yellow kernels stretching into the darkness. Nothing moved. No animals, no footprints, no sign of anything alive. Jacob let out a quiet breath. Maybe he had been imagining things. He dragged the video timeline toward the end, about to shut the computer off. And that was when he saw it. Near the corner of the frame, the grain moved. Not from the camera, not from the wind. A small section of the corn slowly lifted upward, just slightly, like something underneath it was pushing its way toward the surface. Jacob couldn't sleep after watching the video. He replayed the final seconds 3 different times. Every time, the same thing happened. A small section of the corn slowly lifted, then settled again. Not quickly, not violently, just a slow movement, like something breathing beneath the grain. Jacob shut off the computer and sat in the dark living room. The farm outside was silent, only the wind moving across the empty fields. But one thought kept returning to his mind. If something was under the grain, then it had been there long before he bought the farm. And if it was still there now, it meant it had never left. That night, Jacob decided to walk out to the silo. Not to open it, just to listen. He pulled on a heavy jacket and grabbed a flashlight, then stepped outside. The air was cold. The sky was completely dark. No moon, no wind. The silo stood ahead of him like a tall shadow in the middle of the field. Jacob stopped about 30 feet from the door and waited. At first, there was nothing, only the quiet emptiness of the farm. Then the sound began again. A dry, shifting noise, like someone stirring a huge pile of sand. Jacob aimed the flashlight toward the metal door. The beam reflected off the cold steel, but the sound continued, slow, steady. This time it didn't sound like footsteps. It sounded like something crawling, moving slowly beneath thousands of kernels of grain. Jacob took one cautious step closer. Immediately the sound stopped. The field fell completely silent. Jacob stood still, listening. 10 seconds passed, then 20. Then the sound returned, but now it was closer to the door. Jacob felt a tightness in his chest. Whatever was moving inside the silo was coming toward him. He lowered the flashlight beam toward the narrow gap under the metal door. The inside was completely dark, but the shifting sound continued beneath the grain. Slow, careful, like something digging its way through the corn. Jacob slowly stepped backward, then another step, and suddenly the sound stopped again. The entire farm went silent. Jacob turned and started walking back toward the house. But just before he reached the porch, he heard one final sound behind him. A quiet knock from the inside of the silo door. Once, then again, and a third time. Knock, knock, knock. Jacob barely slept that night. The 3 knocks kept repeating in his head. Once, twice, 3 times. It wasn't the sound of metal cooling. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like someone knocking from the inside. The next morning, Jacob walked back to the silo. Sunlight covered the entire field. The farm looked quiet, normal. The tall concrete tower stood exactly where it always had, silent, unmoving. Jacob pulled open the heavy steel door. The hinges groaned loudly. He pointed his flashlight down into the silo. The grain looked the same as before, a wide yellow surface resting in the bottom of the tower. But this time, Jacob had brought something with him. A long metal shovel. If something was hiding under the grain, he was going to find it. Jacob stepped inside the silo. His boots echoed softly against the concrete floor. The air inside felt colder, thicker. He stood at the edge of the grain and pushed the shovel down into it. Corn kernels slid aside. He dug deeper, then deeper again. Nothing, just grain. Jacob exhaled slowly. Maybe the entire thing had been his imagination. But as he pulled the shovel upward, the metal edge struck something solid. A dull clank echoed inside the silo. Jacob froze. Then he dug harder. Grain spilled away from the shovel, and slowly, something gray began to appear beneath the corn. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't metal. Jacob dropped to his knees and brushed the grain aside with his hands, and when the object finally became visible, Jacob stopped moving. It was a rusted metal ladder. The ladder disappeared downward into darkness, beneath the grain. Jacob had never seen it before. He pointed the flashlight downward. The beam revealed a small concrete chamber beneath the base of the silo. Jacob swallowed. Maybe the previous owner had built a storage pit. Maybe it was just an old maintenance space. He placed his foot on the ladder and slowly climbed down. The chamber below was small, barely large enough for one person to stand. Concrete walls surrounded him, damp, cold. There was no door, no tunnel, no other exit. But on the dusty floor, Jacob saw something that made his stomach tighten. Handprints. Dozens of them. Some pressed upward, some dragged across the floor, as if someone had been trying to climb back up through the grain. Jacob stood, frozen in the darkness. Then he heard the sound again, the shifting grain. But this time, it wasn't coming from above. It was coming from beneath him. Slowly, Jacob lowered the flashlight toward the concrete floor. A thin crack ran across the ground, and through that crack, a few corn kernels began to rise, one by one, as if something underneath the silo was pushing them upward. Jacob sold the farm 3 days later. He never explained why. The new owners moved in during the spring. They said the silo was perfect for storing grain. But a neighbor later mentioned something strange. Sometimes, late at night, they could hear a faint rustling sound from the field, like dry corn shifting in the dark. And every now and then, 3 quiet knocks echoed from inside the silo. Once, twice, 3 times.